One handcuff is already closed around Marcus Reed's wrist. The second cuff hangs open, swinging slightly against his knuckles. "You're being detained for obstruction," Officer Colin Mercer says. Marcus doesn't pull away. He doesn't raise his voice. He asks one question, evenly, the way a man asks something he already suspects has no answer. "What action created the obstruction?" Mercer doesn't respond. Sergeant Gavin Pike looks down at the mobile terminal instead of looking at Marcus. The screen glows with accusations, suspicious activity, possible payment fraud, refusal to identify. Every category filled in except one. The complainant field is empty. Danielle Reed watches the screen from across the booth, upside down, and reads it faster than either officer expects her to. She lifts her phone. She doesn't hide it. She doesn't ask permission. "Clear record," she says quietly. "Contact integrity compromised." Pike reaches for the phone. She sets it flat on the table, screen up, and slides her hand away from it. It isn't stored only here anymore. 3 blocks away, inside an unmarked sedan parked behind a shuttered laundromat, Captain Elena Brooks watches a live feed populate on a laptop balanced on her knee. Report categories are changing in real time. Suspicious activity becomes disorderly conduct. Disorderly conduct becomes possible trespass. The complainant field stays blank through every version. Brooks picks up a secure radio. "Everyone hold," she says. "We need the sequence, not just the ending." Then sharper. "The second a cuff closes or anyone touches that woman's phone, we move. Not before, not after." Colin Mercer believes in this exact moment that he is writing the first official account of what happened this morning. He has no reason yet to think otherwise. He does not know that an investigation examining his own reports for the past 11 months has just been handed a version history no one can quietly delete. To understand how a hand ended up resting on a man's shoulder in a diner booth at 7 in the morning, it helps to go back 15 minutes before any of it started. Marcus and Danielle Reed had been awake for 19 hours. Marcus worked out of the State Public Integrity Unit. Danielle worked out of the Inspector General's office. Different desks, different chains of command, paired on Operation Clear Record only after both units disclosed the marriage and a joint oversight panel signed off, on the condition that neither would investigate the other's findings alone. They'd spent the night in a parked car 2 streets from a warehouse leased under a shell company, watching a rotation of patrol units stop by a loading dock that had no business reason to be watched by police at 2 in the morning. The warehouse sat inside the contractor's own security perimeter, its cameras and license plate reader supplied and monitored by the same private company under investigation. That reader had already logged their gray sedan and its out-of-county plate 3 times overnight. It flagged the vehicle again when they pulled out at dawn, and the alert routed, as all of that contractor's alerts did, to a phone that belonged to Sergeant Gavin Pike's cousin, who forwarded anything unfamiliar near the warehouse straight to Pike without asking questions. Pike, in turn, sent Mercer a 2 text. Unfamiliar plate, followed by a location a few minutes later when the sedan parked at Lawson's. By sunrise, Marcus and Danielle were simply tired, hungry, and ready for eggs. They had no idea the same system they were investigating had already clocked their arrival. The diner they chose was the closest one with its lights on, and neither of them thought twice about it. It wasn't a stop written into any operational plan, wasn't tied to any surveillance target on their own list. What they didn't know was that it had just become one on someone else's. Its name was stenciled in chipped gold paint on the window, Lawson's. Inside, the booths were cracked vinyl, patched in places with silver tape. A ceiling fan turned lazily above a case of pies nobody had touched yet. Beth Lawson, 58, moved behind the counter with the practiced economy of someone who had run the place alone for 6 years. She poured coffee without looking at the cup, refilled a sugar jar from a bag under the counter, and glanced twice at the security camera bolted above the door, the way she did every morning out of habit rather than concern. Marcus and Danielle sat in a booth near the window, in plain clothes, next to the old gray sedan they'd parked with an out-of-county plate still registered under a cover identity. They ordered eggs, toast, coffee. They paid with a card, the receipt printed cleanly, curling out of the machine by the register. Beth tore it off and set it on the counter, without a second thought. Nothing about the transaction was unusual. Nothing about the morning suggested it would become anything other than a quiet breakfast before a long drive home. Then the bell over the door rang, and Officer Colin Mercer walked in, phone still in his hand from reading Pike's text. He was 34, broad-shouldered, comfortable in the way a man is comfortable, in a room he's used to controlling. He nodded at Beth like they were old acquaintances, which they were, and let his eyes drift across the diner. A family of 4 sat in the corner booth, the one with the best view of the parking lot. Mercer walked over and said something low, and within a minute the family was gathering their things and moving to a smaller table near the kitchen. No explanation was given. None was expected. Mercer took the corner booth for himself, ordered nothing, and let his gaze continue around the room. A man near the window was scrolling through a security camera catalog on his phone, comparing megapixel counts out loud to no one. Mercer's eyes passed over him without pausing. They stopped instead on Marcus and Danielle, a black couple in plain clothes in a booth by the window. The plate matched the text on his phone. Plain clothes that gave away nothing. A woman glancing toward the exits. A habit built over years of training rather than guilt. A man sitting with his back to the wall. To Mercer, none of it read as ordinary breakfast behavior. It read as something to investigate, the same way it had read that way 18 times before, with 18 different people who happened to look like they didn't belong in rooms he considered his. A pattern a later audit would find was not evenly distributed, and that Vega would treat as evidence to examine rather than a headline to lead with. He crossed the diner and stopped at their booth. "Morning," he said. "I need both of you to put your phones on the table." It was an order with no lawful weight behind it, nothing that resembled reasonable suspicion, nothing beyond a plate matching a text message. Marcus knew that. He set his phone down anyway, slowly, screen facing up, because refusing outright would only hand Mercer a different sentence to write. Danielle did the same a moment later. "Are we being detained?" Marcus asked. "Or is this voluntary?" Mercer didn't answer directly. "There's been some concern about payment fraud in the area," he said, "and some concern about business reconnaissance. I'm going to need you to cooperate." "Concern from who?" Marcus asked. Beth Lawson, standing behind the counter with a coffee pot still in her hand, spoke up. "Their payment cleared," she said. "I didn't call anybody. I didn't report fraud. Nobody asked me to have anyone removed." Mercer glanced at her. "Get back behind the counter," he said, and Beth, after a pause that lasted a beat too long, did. She set the coffee pot down harder than she meant to, and the sound of glass on steel was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. Mercer pulled a mobile terminal from his belt and began typing. The report opened with 3 fields highlighted in red. Officer initiated contact. No civilian complainant. No observed offense. Marcus watched him fill in the 3rd field with the word suspicious, then delete it and type possible payment fraud. Then delete that too and settle on possible business reconnaissance. "What offense did you personally observe?" Marcus asked. "Before you approached us?" Mercer didn't look up from the screen. "I'm asking the questions." "You can ask them," Marcus said. "I can still ask what offense occurred." Danielle's hand rested flat on the table beside her phone, not moving toward it, not reaching for anything. "We're not unlocking these," she said. "Not without a warrant, and not on a verbal request. That's not the same as refusing to cooperate. We've given you our names. We're sitting here, we haven't left. Refusing a phone search is obstruction," Mercer said. "Declining consent isn't obstruction," Marcus said. "It's declining consent." "We've given you our names," Danielle added. "We handed you IDs when you asked. We haven't stood up. We haven't raised our voices. There's a difference between cooperating with a lawful stop and consenting to a search of everything on these phones, and we're on the right side of that line." The IDs were real, issued under the cover identities their assignment used. and neither officer had bothered to run them before Mercer typed refusal to identify into the field anyway. Mercer's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer, placing one hand on Marcus's shoulder, not gripping, just resting there, a small assertion of control more than a restraint. Beth spoke again from behind the counter, her voice thinner this time. The payment was valid. Nobody complained. I don't understand what's happening here. Nobody answered her. That was when Sergeant Gavin Pike arrived. Faster than a routine backup call should have brought him, stepping through the door with the calm of a man who had done this before and expected it to go the way it always went. He didn't speak to Beth. He didn't look at the receipt curling on the counter beside the register. He didn't ask the man with the security camera catalog, still sitting 3 booths away, whether he'd seen anything. He walked straight to the terminal, in Mercer's hand, and read the screen. Complainant, blank. Observed offense, blank. He didn't ask why. He typed instead. The category shifted from possible business reconnaissance to suspicious activity. Then, a moment later, to disorderly conduct review. Then, after Marcus asked a second time who exactly had lodged a trespass complaint, to possible trespass. Who reported trespass? Marcus asked. Beth's voice, from behind the counter, was quieter now but still clear. I never asked them to leave. Pike didn't respond to her directly. Instead, he mentioned, almost offhandedly, that the health inspection, scheduled for next month, tended to go smoother for businesses that cooperated with routine police matters. He mentioned the fire marshal's review too, and something about a parking variance the diner had been waiting on for 8 months. He said none of it as a threat. He didn't have to. Beth felt the floor of her own diner shift under her, and she took one step back, closer to the register, farther from the booth. She thought, in that moment of the inspection 2 years earlier, that had cost her a week of closed doors over a paperwork error. Nobody had bothered to explain to her, and of how quickly a friendly conversation with the right official could turn into a delay that lasted months. The fear wasn't abstract. It had a shape she'd already lived through once. Pike glanced at her retreat and noted it, silently, as agreement. It was not agreement. It was fear wearing the shape of silence, and Beth would carry the weight of that distinction for the rest of the day. Mercer unclipped his handcuffs from his belt. A small sensor built into the cuff case triggered the instant the flap opened, activating his body camera automatically, a red light blinking to life at his collar. Department policy tied the two together for exactly this reason. No cuffing could occur off camera, whatever else happened around it. Pike noticed the light immediately. He said something into his radio about routing the footage through supervisor review before automatic upload. A real setting, meant for genuine privacy exceptions that required a second officer's sign-off and left its own time-stamped entry. Pike knew that. He requested the delay anyway, and the request itself became one more line in a log he didn't control. Mercer closed one cuff around Marcus's wrist. "You're being detained for obstruction," he said. And that is the moment the story began. The moment already described, the open cuff swinging, the blank complainant field glowing on the terminal, Danielle's voice steady across the table. Clear record. Contact integrity compromised. What Danielle's app did, in that instant, was 2 separate things, and neither of them was complicated. First, she photographed the terminal herself, plainly, in view of both officers, the way any bystander could photograph anything visible in a public booth. The image caught the blank complainant field and the wall clock above the counter in the same frame, a useful visual anchor later, though not the record anyone would rely on to prove a timestamp. Second, her single tap sent an alert to Captain Brooks, telling her nothing more than, "Open the feed now." That feed already existed. A judge had authorized the task force, months earlier, to mirror Mercer's and Pike's report metadata and version history in real time as part of the open corruption investigation. Not their whole department's systems, not anyone else's file, just the 2 named accounts under active review. The app didn't reach into any database. It didn't need to. It just made sure a human being was watching the authorized feed at the moment that mattered, and that the terminal's own server-side timestamps, not a photo of a wall clock, would be what the record ultimately relied on. What it guaranteed in practice was simple. Whatever existed on that screen at that second could never be quietly rewritten without the rewriting itself becoming part of the permanent history. Pike reached for Danielle's phone. She placed it flat, screen up, and didn't move it again. "It isn't stored only here anymore," she said. At a booth near the window, Monica Ellis, 36, sat with her 4-year-old son, a half-eaten pancake between them, and watched all of it happen from 6 feet away. Her son tugged her sleeve. "Why are they arresting that man, Mommy?" Monica didn't answer him yet. She had already lifted her phone and started recording, quietly, angled low against the table edge, and she was already calculating whether she would upload it anonymously and disappear, or whether she would have to say her name out loud in a room where a man in uniform had just closed a handcuff around someone who hadn't raised his voice once. She knew 3 things with total certainty. No one had complained. The couple had paid. No one had asked them to leave. She thought about the last time she'd seen something like this, at a hardware store 2 neighborhoods over, and how she'd told herself afterward that it wasn't her place to say anything, that someone else surely would. No one else had. She wasn't going to make that same bet twice. Behind the counter, Beth Lawson made a decision of her own. She stepped into the small office behind the kitchen, pulled up the point-of-sale system, and exported the payment record, the itemized receipt, and 40 minutes of security footage to an off-site cloud account she'd set up 2 years earlier after a break-in, an account no one in this diner but her had ever needed. The upload bar crawled forward, 11%, then 30%, then 60%, while her hands trembled slightly on the keyboard. Out in the dining room, Mercer had begun narrating a different version of events to no one in particular, the way officers sometimes do when a scene needs a story before the story needs facts. "They refused payment," he said. "Owner asked them to leave. They got confrontational. He resisted." None of it was true, and all of it was being said loudly enough for Beth to hear from the office doorway. She came back out, receipt in hand, and said it plainly. "I own this business. I didn't call the police. I never asked anyone to leave. There's a receipt right here." Monica stood up from her booth. Her son's hand was still wrapped around a fork. "My name is Monica Ellis," she said. "I was here before the officer walked in. I saw the receipt print. I heard her say the payment cleared. I have all of it on video." "Sit down," Mercer said. She didn't. Her statement, like her recording, now existed in more than one place, and no order from a patrol officer could erase either. Beth returned a second time, with a duplicate receipt printed fresh from the machine, holding it out where anyone could see it. "The original and the footage are already saved somewhere else," she said. "I sent them before you walked back over here." Pike tried to close the incident report. The terminal refused the command. A line of text appeared where the close button should have worked. "External evidence preservation active, edits logged." He tried again. Every attempt stayed visible in a version history he could not touch, each edit stamped with his own badge number. The instant the alert showed the first cuff closed, Brooks was already moving, radio still in her hand, 2 sedans pulling out from behind the laundromat before Mercer had finished his sentence. 3 blocks took under 2 minutes. What happened at the diner in that window? Beth's upload, Monica's video, Mercer's narration, Pike's failed attempt to close the report, happened while Brooks's team was already in motion toward them, not because she'd chosen to let it happen. 2 unmarked sedans pulled into the lot without lights, without sirens, parking at angles that blocked nothing and announced nothing. Captain Elena Brooks stepped out first, followed by Inspector General Nora Vega and 2 members of the task force. They didn't walk toward Marcus. They didn't walk toward Mercer. Brooks's voice carried across the room, calm and specific. "Nobody touches the terminal. Nobody touches a witness's phone. Nobody moves the couple. Nobody accesses or delays that body camera footage. Nobody calls Department T." Brooks had watched enough of these unfold on a screen to know the danger wasn't only in what happened next. but in whoever moved first without thinking. She kept her team at the doorway a full 30 seconds longer than anyone wanted, making sure nothing in the room shifted before it had been recorded exactly as it stood. Vega moved methodically through the diner, reading the scene the way she'd read hundreds of them before, in order, without skipping ahead. The blank complainant field, the blank observed offense field, the receipt on the counter, Beth's statement, Monica's video still recording, the timestamp on Mercer's body camera activation, the 4 category changes logged under Pike's badge, the supervisor approval stamped onto an incident that had never had a complainant, the timing of Mercer's justification filed only after Marcus had asked his second legal question. "Remove the cuff," Vega said. Mercer hesitated only a second before complying. Only after the restraint came off, only after the scene had been frozen and documented exactly as it stood, did Marcus reach into his jacket and produce his credentials. "Detective Marcus Reed," he said. "State Public Integrity Unit." Danielle followed. "Detective Danielle Reed, Inspector General's Office." They were married, and they were both assigned to something called Operation Clear Record, and neither of those facts made what had just happened lawful or unlawful on its own. Their marriage wasn't the point. Their titles weren't the point. The externally preserved evidence was the point, and it existed whether or not anyone in that diner had ever learned their names. Marcus said nothing about the wasted morning, the hours of surveillance that had already cost him, and Danielle a full night's sleep before any of this began. He rubbed his wrist once where the cuff had sat and let the moment pass without comment. Marcus and Danielle did not outrank Mercer or Pike inside the local department's chain of command, and they made no move to act like they did. What they carried, instead, was the record of a pattern that had started long before that morning. For nearly a year, Operation Clear Record had been examining a string of officer-initiated contacts inside the department. Contacts that began without complainants and ended with businesses quietly losing customers, permits delayed, competitors pressured out of neighborhoods. 18 questionable contacts across several businesses. Roughly 11 civilians affected. Nearly $140,000 in payments disguised as consulting fees, routed through a relative of Sergeant Pike's and a shell company, tied to a private contractor supplying the city with parking enforcement technology, warehouse security cameras, and alarm monitoring services. The model was simple once Vega laid it out. The contractor sold small businesses a monthly security monitoring subscription. Cameras, alarm response, a direct line to patrol. Owners who signed got quiet, uneventful blocks. Owners who declined, or who used a competitor's system, got Mercer, a suspicious person report near their loading dock, a lingering presence at closing time that scared off the dinner rush, a routine contact that showed up in their business's public record whether or not anything came of it. Pike approved the reports, adjusted the retention windows before anyone could review the footage, and steered a cut of every new subscription back through his cousin's consulting invoices. A suspicious person report near a rival's loading dock. A discouraging word to an owner considering the contractor's fee. A quietly shortened footage retention setting just before an incident anyone might want to review later. Mercer's reports made each contact look routine. Pike's approvals made them look official. Neither man had invented an entire criminal enterprise from nothing. They had simply learned, contact by contact, how far an empty field could stretch before someone noticed it was empty. Not every one of the 18 contacts would turn out to be criminal. Vega insisted on that distinction from the first day of the review. Each case would be examined on its own evidence, not swept together under a single verdict. Some contacts, once reopened, would turn out to be exactly what the original reports claimed. A genuine dispute, a legitimate concern, an officer doing ordinary work without any hidden hand behind it. Vega was as careful to say that out loud as she was to flag the ones that weren't. That carefulness mattered to the investigation's credibility. A pattern built on selective outrage would have been no better than the pattern it was meant to correct. Digital examiners spent weeks pulling apart the department's servers, recovering earlier drafts of reports that had supposedly never existed, restoring complainant fields someone had overwritten, and then cleared from the visible log. They found footage retention windows quietly shortened from 90 days to 14, always in the days just before an incident someone might later want to review. They found text messages between Mercer and Pike discussing which businesses needed a visit, and invoices from the contractor written in language vague enough to survive a glance, but not a careful audit. None of it had been designed to withstand this kind of attention, because until that morning, nothing ever had to. At the diner, no one was arrested on the spot. Mercer and Pike surrendered their badges, their weapons, their access cards, and their department-issued devices, placed on administrative suspension, pending a criminal investigation that would proceed through warrants and independent review, not through anything decided in a booth over cooling coffee. Weeks later, at Mercer's disciplinary hearing, the room watched his own body camera footage beside his own final written report, the two things playing almost side by side. His report said the couple had refused payment. The footage showed a receipt that had printed before he ever walked through the door. His report said the owner asked them to leave. The footage showed Beth saying, twice, that she never had. His report said the male suspect resisted. The footage showed Marcus asking a single question about obstruction and then standing still. The category changes lined up exactly with the moments Marcus had asked about legal authority, each new label appearing seconds after each new question. A digital examiner walked the panel through the timestamps twice, once quickly and once slowly, so that no one in the room could later claim the sequence was ambiguous. It wasn't. The pattern held on every replay. Consequences followed the evidence rather than outrunning it. Mercer faced termination, the likely revocation of his certification, and referral for charges under the state's deprivation of rights under color of law statute, filing a false report, and evidence tampering. The exact counts, still subject to what the prosecutor's office and the grand jury decided the record supported, with the unlawful restraint itself treated as an aggravating fact rather than a separate charge in its own right. Pike faced accusations of bribery, obstruction, evidence tampering, and false certification, along with the likely end of any future in law enforcement or public contracting. The contractor lost its city contract within the month, and 2 of its executives were referred for fraud and bribery charges pending further investigation. Officers and staff with no connection to the scheme were left alone. Vega was explicit that association without evidence would not become its own form of punishment. The department's other patrol officers, most of whom had never heard the contractor's name before that week, went on filing their ordinary reports, working their ordinary shifts, watched more closely for a while by an internal audit that found nothing to flag in nearly all of it. That, too, was part of the outcome worth stating plainly. The corruption had a name, a shape, and a limit, and it did not belong to everyone who wore the same uniform. The hearing itself lasted most of a day, longer than anyone expected, because Vega insisted on walking the panel through every version of the report in order, rather than jumping straight to the final one. Watching the categories shift on a projector screen, one after another, in the exact sequence they'd changed that morning, did more to convince the room than any single piece of testimony could have. Every one of the 18 flagged contacts was reopened. Incorrect reports weren't deleted. They were corrected, marked unsupported or false, and left attached permanently to the incident's history, so the record itself would carry both the original claim and the correction beside it. Civilians affected by the pattern received written explanations of what had gone wrong in their cases. Fees taken under questionable circumstances were returned where the evidence supported it. Cases touched by altered records were sent for independent review outside the department. For some of the 11 civilians affected, the correction came too late to undo everything. A canceled lease stayed canceled. A missed contract stayed missed. Vega's office couldn't rewrite the months that had already passed, only make sure the record finally matched what had actually happened in them, and make sure whatever came next for those businesses wouldn't be built on the same false footing. Beth admitted quietly to Vega that she'd stayed silent through 2 earlier contacts out of fear for the business she'd spent 17 years building. Monica admitted her first instinct that morning had been to upload the video anonymously and disappear. Neither admission erased what came before it. What mattered was that this time, both women had chosen differently, and that choice now sat in the record beside their earlier silence. Both true at once. The department adopted a list of reforms in the months that followed. Officers could still approach anyone and ask voluntary questions. Nothing in the new policy touched consensual inquiry. But the moment a contact became a detention, a search demand, or a formal enforcement action, cuffs, a phone seized, a trespass charge, anything that stopped someone from simply finishing their coffee and leaving, it would require a named complainant, an objectively observed offense, or articulable facts written into the report before it began, not filled in afterward to match whatever had already happened. A business owner's response would be recorded as a mandatory part of any such contact. Trespass allegations would need to identify, specifically, who had requested a person's removal. Every report would carry a permanent, unerasable version history. Changing an incident's category would require a new objective fact, not simply a supervisor's discretion. Supervisors would be barred from approving or closing complaints in which they had any personal or financial interest. Body camera footage would upload automatically the instant a restraint left an officer's belt, with independent approval required before any delay could be authorized. Civilian witnesses recording police conduct would receive explicit protection under department policy. Business owners would be given an anti-retaliation channel to report pressure without fear of it costing them a permit. Contractor payments to the department would undergo independent audits going forward. None of it arrived as a single sweeping order. It came policy by policy, tested against real shifts over the following months. The sugar jar on the counter had been refilled a dozen times since that morning. The ceiling fan still turned lazily over the pie case. Nothing about the diner itself had changed, and that, in its own way, was the point. Weeks later, Marcus and Danielle sat in the same booth by the window at Lawson's. Beth brought eggs, toast, and coffee, the same order as before, and set it down without ceremony. Monica came in briefly for a takeout order, her son trailing behind her, and nodded once toward the booth on her way out. No one gave a speech. Beth asked, once quietly, whether they'd be back again, and Danielle said probably, since the eggs were good and the drive home usually left them hungry anyway. It wasn't meant as anything more than that, and Beth didn't take it as anything more either. Marcus paid, and Beth set the receipt down on the table in plain view, the way she always had, the way she always should have been able to. Across town, at police headquarters, another officer opened a new officer-initiated contact report on his terminal. The complainant field sat blank. The observed offense field sat blank. A supervisor tried to approve a disorderly conduct charge anyway. The approval button stayed gray, unresponsive, no matter how many times he clicked it. A single line of text appeared on the screen instead. State the objective basis before authorization. The report stayed open, unfinished, waiting for a fact that hadn't happened yet. For years, 2 officers had turned blank spaces into official accusations, one field at a time, until the practice became so routine it stopped feeling like a decision at all. Real reform didn't arrive with a dramatic reveal in a diner booth. It arrived quietly, the day the system itself refused to let anyone sign beneath an empty space and call it the truth. Should every change made to a police report stay permanently visible, no matter who made it, and why? Let us know what you think in the comments. Gh Shu Slan Suat, Kung Tuakikban, Title Day Swat. A cop handcuffed him for obstruction. But no one had reported a crime Fungan Kak. The cop changed the charge 4 times. Every version of his report was being recorded. Thumbnail Day Swat. Cận cảnh terminal với dòng chữ complain. Blank làm text chính. Marcus ở tiền cảnh với một còng tay, Mercer đứng phía trên, Danielle cầm điện thoại ở hậu cảnh. Tránh hình súng, còng tay kép hoặc đám đông.